Today we're going to be talking about answering the tell me about a time when things didn't go right types of questions that happen in job interviews. A lot of job interviews focus on, the good things about you, the strengths that you bring, the things that you've accomplished, your greater successes. But occasionally you'll get a question that is more negative leaning that wants you to address sort of the negative aspects, the things that didn't go right. And so we'll talk about some strategies in terms of how to do that specifically, but also more broadly, how to answer these types of questions, whether they are positive or more negative focused. My name is Dr. Joseph Barber. I'm the Director of Graduate Career Initiatives here at Penn's Career Services. So let's think about interview questions in general terms when you are going to interviews. Now, I'm talking about interviews in general terms, right? So not a specific industry or career field, a particular type of role, just broadly interviews. So this is applicable sort of no matter where you are, what industry you're going into, what career field you're interested in. These are general strategies that I think will be helpful for you. But there are certainly different types of questions that you're going to come across and face in these interviews. Questions about you, about what it is that you obviously bring to the role and what you can do well and what your skills are, and how people would describe you and what that sort of would mean for the teams that you're going into. The sort of the why questions. Why do you want to work here? Why do you want to use your skills in this particular context? Why are the things that you've done in the past even relevant to what you're wanting to do right now? Sort of what is the story behind that are some of these questions. And then there's going to be a specific focus on some of the relevant skills that you have, right? These are going to be skills that are very specific to the job that you're applying to, things that they need you to have in order for you to be successful in the role. So they'll want to get a sense of how well you can use these skills. What do those skills look like for you? How have you used them successfully and productively to achieve things, to achieve goals, to make projects successful? And so those are sort of the behavioral-based skills that we'll sort of be touching on. Now, out of these first two categories are sort of the 5 questions that I always say that people should be 100% ready for in any interviews. These are questions that will likely come up in any interview that you go to. And so you should be ready and eager and excited to answer these questions. Obviously, the tell me about yourself question is a sort of a key aspect of that. And we do have a video on our YouTube channel where we walk through how you might structure that answer. But I'll also show in the big interview workshop after this, they have some great advice for that as well. What do you know about us? Obviously, that's your research. Hopefully you do know about the organization that you're applying to, because that's why you're applying and why you're excited. But they also want you to be able to articulate that. And so that's a question that often comes up as well. Why do you want this job is sort of the main question that anyone needs to ask and answer in a job interview scenario. So, you're applying for this thing. Why do you want it? The answer to this question is sort of a 2-part answer. The first part is what you are able to bring to the job. And the second part is what you're able to get from and gain from having this job. Obviously, from the employer's perspective, what you bring to the job is far more relevant to them at the beginning. They really want to make sure that they are spending time engaging with people who can add value to the work. So when they say, why do you want this job? Your answer shouldn't, first be, because this is going to be such a great opportunity for me, or because I'm going to gain so much from this opportunity, because that's a you benefit, it's not a them benefit. So the first part of that answer always needs to be, because, based on my understanding that you need X, Y, and Z, I can do X, and here's an example, and I can do Y, and here's another example, and I'm excited about, doing more of Z as well. And then you can talk about the fact that you might like to work in a small organization or a startup, or, whatever the reason is behind you wanting to sort of position yourself in that role. That is part B of that answer. What do you bring to this role? This is sort of a strengths question to a certain extent. What are your greatest strengths? And any strengths that you talk about in an interview should be specific to the role that you're applying to. Your strengths want to be relevant strengths so that those can be exciting. But you should be ready for a question like this. You should say, yes, let me tell you how the skills that I have and the knowledge and the experience really can add value to this work. And then you can give examples of what it has looked like and think about what it will look like as part of your the answer that you give. And that's a suite of questions. It's not just a single question oftentimes. And then do you have any questions for us? And just a reminder that the answer is always yes. No matter, even if they've answered all the questions that you had written down on your piece of paper during the interview, you should always ask questions. You really need to engage with the interviewer. And there are many questions about the role that you could ask, about the expectations, about who you'll be working with, about the types of projects, about the mentoring and the training that you could get. There's a sort of numerous questions that you can ask there that show that you're engaged in that role. So these are just the top 5 questions. I want to spend a little bit of time here just going through those, just so that that it's critical to have good answers to those questions without having to think about it. Perhaps the more challenging questions are these behavioral-based ones, where they really want to dive into specific examples of what these experiences have looked like for you. Now, the behaviors that they're going to ask you about should be linked to obviously the things that they need you to have for the job. There's no point asking you about leadership experience, for example, if the role that you're applying to has no leadership of anything. Now, they may, that's up to them, but really these behavioral-based questions that you face in interviews are situated around the skills and the knowledge areas that they want you to have in that role. So it shouldn't be surprising when you get a question about, tell me, give me an example of a time when you worked as part of a team, if teamwork and collaboration is a key part of the role that you're applying to, right? So you should know ahead of time with some confidence that certain questions, certain types of behaviors, will be asked about in these behavioral-based questions. Now, these are examples just, again, plucked out of different industries, different fields, but examples of what these behavioral-based questions can look like. And I provided a link here to a whole sort of 12-page document of different behavioral-based questions, because there are so many behaviors that you could ask about, but even within those, there's lots of sort of different versions of that. All of these are sort of descriptive story-based questions, right? Give me an example of a time when, describe a situation, how has this looked for you? What does this look like for you, right? And so you can't answer these questions in general terms. You can't sort of say hypothetically, this is how I would do this, or this is what I would do. What they really want from you is, this is what I did do, and this is how that's relevant to this role moving forward. So sometimes it's hard because they'll ask you a behavioral-based question for which you haven't actually done that thing or experienced that thing in a way that is entirely connected to the role that you're going into. And so you may need to find an adjacent experience that demonstrates something similar. But again, it's really about good, strong, real-life examples that illustrate these things in action. And what we'll cover as part of today is how to structure those answers to make sure that your stories and your examples are easy to understand, are meaningful, and are impactful. This is from that document that I just linked to in the previous one. And basically what we did here is we sort of put together questions that covered the same type of behavior, right? So critical thinking as a sort of behavioral complex and decision-making as a complex of behaviors. But all of these questions sort of ask the same type of question, or they ask about the same behavior, but from slightly different perspectives. So that doesn't mean obviously that you need to go through this and try to create an answer to 400 different questions, because really the answer is the same answer. It's the same example that you might give. You might rotate it and look at that example through different perspectives, but a solid example can be manipulated to answer the majority of these types of questions that fall under a certain behavioral category. Again, when you're preparing for interviews, you don't want just one example to cover lots of behaviors, or even just the same behavior, right? So you should have a couple of examples of collaboration or of leadership or of problem solving, so that you can sort of explore and utilize those answers differently in the interview. You don't just want one story for an entire 45-minute interview, because that's not going to be as compelling. But we can see here there's a lot of repetition. Now, many of these questions are positive questions, and they sort of allow you to sort of explain you at your best, right? Just as a reminder, these types of questions behavioral-based questions do pop up in all types of career fields and industries, right? Whether you're applying for faculty roles or consulting or research and development roles, people want to know about the way that you do things and how you approach the work that you're doing, right? So they form a different percentage of the interviewing questions, but they're always going to be there, because that's really how people are going to judge you. So here's an example then of sort of, a positive question. Give me an example of a team experience that was successful, right? And then you can think back to a student group you were part of, or a lab collaboration that you were in, and you can think about all the things that went well. Or rather, you can tell the story about all the good things that happened, knowing that it's always a mix of things that are challenging and things that are good. But at the end of this story, you might be able to say, we worked as part of this team on this project to do this. We were able to contribute and work well together, and we achieved first place in this competition, and we were joyful, and it was great, right? That's a nice story to be able to tell. Tell me about a successful collaboration, right? That's going to be a key aspect of many of the jobs that you're applying to, working not just with people immediately around you, but collaborating with a different division or different people. And so you can tell that story about how you communicated effectively across the academic divide, as it were, and you're able to understand people and bring people up to speed. And there's lots of great things that you can sort of highlight as part of that positive experience. And then the questions might come slightly differently, right? Tell me about a time where you failed to convince someone. right? So you're trying to make a change, you're trying to make a different direction in your research, and someone says to you, no. And no matter what you say, the answer is still no, right? So it's actually hard to find stock imagery of people sort of not feeling positive. But this person has been looked at very critically, as if what they're pointing to is not right and is not going to convince the lady in the black top there. So this person may be failing to convince this person. Tell me about a time when the innovative approach that you took didn't work, right? So none of these people seem, in my stock image here, seem to have a joyful expression. So perhaps what this person is identifying isn't good and didn't work, right? So your example would be, well, we tried this and actually the data didn't come out right, or I wasted 6 months of time because we weren't able to achieve the goal and we had to start again from scratch to take a different approach. So there's certainly negative things that do happen. Tell me about a time when you were part of a team that didn't work well together. And to be honest, everyone's been part of a team that didn't work well together. If you haven't been part of a team that didn't work together, then you haven't had enough teamwork experience to a certain extent, because humans by fault tend not to work well together unless everyone's trying their hardest to make that happen. And so these are realities, right? These are not bad things to a certain extent. They are things that happen naturally all the time to people. It's okay for these to have them. But the question that you should sort of be asking yourself is, well, wait a minute, why does the interviewer want me to talk about things that went wrong, right? What's behind that? What's the intent behind that question? Now, certainly what it's not is an opportunity for you to sort of have a sort of an emotional therapy about things that just were bad. You're like, oh my God, let me tell you about these people that I worked with who were terrible and the project didn't work, right? Obviously, that's not to your advantage, because throwing anyone under the bus is not good practice when you're in an interview scenario where you're going to be collaborating with people in similarly challenging situations. It's not something that you want to share entirely everything that went wrong with the situation, right? There are some stories that have good takeaways, that may be negative takeaways, but there are some aspects of that story that are not for sharing in an interview. They are for you to process and understand and experience. But the version that you might share in the interview, while still being an authentic, realistic version of it, doesn't have to go into the worst parts of that, right? Because that's not necessarily where you want to go emotionally either during an interview, because you want the interview to be a energizing experience. And so if you have to go back to a time in your head where things went horribly, horribly wrong, that's going to affect, I think, how you come across in the interview scenario. Probably the main intent for these types of questions is a realization that these things do happen at any organization, right? There is tension, there's breakdown of teams, there's a breakdown of communication. Sometimes you have a great idea, but your supervisor says, no, we're not going to do that. And the sort of the hiring manager, the hiring team, they want to get a sense of how you handle those things, because that is the day-to-day world that we exist in any organization. Even a really positive organization is going to have some tough times. And so it's a sense of how well will you cope with that, but also how well will you cope with that and the people around you, because the people around you want to be supported. They want to be in a positive environment. They want it to be positive for you. And so they sort of are looking to see how well your way of working and the way that you approach work fits in with the reality of the roles around them. It's also a way for them to get inside your head slightly, right? So the resume is a very sort of structured document. Use this skill to do this thing. It doesn't really give the reader insight into you. The cover letter does a slightly better version of that. But the interview questions, where they get you to sort of walk through the scenario, really opens a door or a window to your inner workings, to your inner thinking, to the way that you think about problems, or what you took away from a problem. Are you someone who takes a failure and then acts on it and then improves on it or learns from it and does something from that? These are good qualities, obviously, to have in a work environment. So it's a strategic question in terms of they really want to get a sense of how you handle challenging situations and what you've learned from that, knowing that you will continue to face some of these things, hopefully not all the time, but from time to time, and they really want to get a sense that you can do that okay. So in order to sort of figure out how to answer these questions, then we have to sort of take a sort of step back and say, well, how do you answer behavioral-based questions in general terms? Because once we've figured out how to answer behavioral-based questions in general terms, the positive ones, we can then address how to handle those more negative leading questions. So I'm going to sort of take a step back from the negative ones to walk us through the process of how to give good answers in general terms. And in most cases, in order to give a good interview answer, you have to start long before you actually get to the interview, right? There's a lot of work that you can be doing to help you understand the nature of the work that you're applying to, the type of team that you may be working with, the types of challenges that you may face, and the types of skills and abilities that you have that might be able to overcome some of those challenges in the roles that you're in. So here are things that you can sort of be thinking about. From a networking perspective, if you want to work in a certain type of field or a certain organization within that field, your networking allows you to have one-on-one conversations with people who have experience in that role or are in that role and know about the challenges and know about what skills they use to overcome those challenges. And the more that you can understand their experience and listen to their experience and the stories that they tell about their experience, the easier it is for you to identify, first of all, what types of questions are likely to come in an interview. I mean, you can even ask someone, what types of questions did you get in your interview? But even understanding the nature of what skills are valued in a particular role will help you figure out what types of questions you're likely to get, what types of behaviors that they're going to be interested in, and what types of stories you might look to from your own experience that can speak to those challenges, right? So understanding the challenges that people face in the role allows you to preemptively say, well, I need to make sure that I talk about the skills that I have that have helped me overcome similar challenges. The job posting also has a lot of information, obviously, about the skills and experiences that they are looking for. And so by making sure that you are doing a deep dive into that job and you're understanding the responsibilities that they are saying and the qualifications that they're looking for, right? So sometimes a job posting says, must be comfortable working in an ambiguous environment. Now that by its nature is an ambiguous statement. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's part of your networking, questions that you can ask. I see that in your job post, they always say you need to be comfortable working in an ambiguous environment. What does that mean, right? What does that look like for you? Why is it ambiguous? Why hasn't someone fixed it if it's ambiguous? Lots of questions that I have about that. But knowing what those terms mean allows you obviously to think about what you have in terms of experiences that match that or skills that you have that to help you overcome some of those things. And you're going to take those experiences and those skills and you're going to make sure that those come to life in your resume and cover letter. And this is the reason, obviously, that you get the interview is because you've successfully articulated the fact that you do have some of those skills and experience and knowledge area. And then you get the invitation to actually do the interviewing. And this is where, obviously, you have your solid foundation from your resume and your cover letter. In the interview, you have to add more to it. You can't just say, as you can see in my resume, I can do this, because they already know that, to get you to the interview. So the stories that you're telling in the interview themselves add more dimensions to those experiences, allow you to sort of focus in on the way that you approach challenges and the way that you use skills and the way that you think about using skills. And this is where these behavioral-based questions allow you to sort of tell more of this story, even more of a story than you might have told in your cover letter already, to really capture the attention of the interviewers and show them and allow them to picture how you use these skills to be successful, right? So again, you can do more research into the role, you can do more networking to get you to that point, but you do need to add more to that, to what you've already given them in terms of your application materials. So by the time you get to the interview, then what the interviewer already knows, the hiring manager knows, is that you have knowledge that can be applied, you have skills that are necessary, you've demonstrated that you've used those skills successfully to be productive. Some of the experiences, broad or specific to your field, whether those are leadership experiences or otherwise, those are helpful. They demonstrate, that you have good leadership or program management or communication. And then they have a couple of extra questions, right? But can you really show me that these skills are going to be helpful for us here at this organization in this role, right? Can you really paint this picture that you have something valuable to add? And are you a good person to work with in terms of your, let's say, emotional intelligence or your judgment or the way that you deal with people and situations around you? Can I, as your future supervisor, imagine working with you and feeling like this is a positive experience for both of us as we go through this, right? And so that fit is hard to define, but people like to work with people that are energizing and positive in most cases. Depends on the nature of the role, I suppose. But that's sort of what people are often looking for when they are a hiring manager in that situation. So the way then to get at those demonstrations of those skills are through what we call STAR stories, right? And STAR is a way to sort of address a behavioral-based question. as you'll see in a second, situation, task, action, result. That's what we're going to be covering in terms of this. But let me give you a sort of just some examples of how you do need some structure to answer these questions. Because when I do mock interviews with students through Penn Career Services, I occasionally will ask a behavioral-based question. In fact, I ask a lot of them, give me an example of a time when you worked as part of a team. Doesn't really matter. It's the same concept. These are some of the responses that I get from students and postdocs when I'm asking this question. Yes, so we were working on a project and this is a good illustration of someone jumping straight into the middle of a story that they know about in their head, but that I have no idea what they're talking about. I don't know when it is, who it is, what it is. I don't know what they're doing, but they've jumped straight into a story about teamwork, leaving all of these questions unanswered. And what happens then is, in my head, I'm trying to sort of figure that out. I'm looking at a resume to see what this person's talking about. I'm saying, well, I don't know who this is. I don't know when this is. And what I'm not doing anymore is listening to the person tell their story, right? So this is going to be a challenging way of starting this type of question because it's not structured. The other common response is not to have any structure at all, not to know where to start, and for the question to sort of be very faltering in terms of getting started. Well, so I think, well, perhaps now a good example, wait, a better example, right? So the question sort of takes a long time to coalesce, and it's hard for the interviewer to sort of get a sense of what's going on because this could go on forever as an answer. It may not actually evolve into a specific answer. That's not a strong start to the question. This is a common one too, right? So people basically just referring back to their materials, looking backwards at what they submitted and say, look, as you can see in my resume, I did something like that. And that's, again, not helpful because you need to build on that. You can't just refer back. As I said, the resume, the cover letter, they get you to the interview. You then, as a three-dimensional entity, need to get you to the offer by adding value to the stories that you're telling. So you really need to be forward-focused in terms of what you're talking about. And if you do point back to the resume, what I'm going to do is start looking at your resume, and then I'm no longer engaging as the interviewer with the candidate, right? Because now I'm looking at the resume, I'm trying to pull it up on my screen or whatever that is, and that's going to be distracted to creating that strong professional relationship that you're trying to do in an interview scenario. And then finally, the behavioral-based questions that trigger a 7-minute answer as opposed to perhaps a more succinct 2-minute answer, where there's a lot of detail and the interviewer's not quite sure how long it's going to go on for, but they don't want to jump in and stop this, but it takes up a lot of time, but doesn't actually give you a lot of content to go on. So again, not great approaches here. We need a little bit of structure to make sure that this works. So here come the STAR stories then: situation, task, action, result. Now, actually, my preference for the acronym is to change the word task, which sounds like just something that you have to do, with the word challenge, which is something that you have to overcome. The problem is that it changes the acronym from STAR, which is very positive and celestial, to SCAR, which is terrifying. So I can understand why people haven't really taken my suggestion to change this. But I think challenge is the better word, because a challenge doesn't have to be a negative thing. A challenge can be an engaging thing, but a challenge is always something that needs to be addressed, to be overcome. And that's, I think, going to be important to sort of get across. So the situation then is the context, right? It's giving all the answers to the questions that I have in my brain. When was this? Who was this? What are you doing? What's going on? It's sort of the shortest part of the story because it's sort of not entirely relevant, because the thing that you may be talking about may have no direct connection to the job that you're applying to. The behavior that you're going to be talking about does, but the actual context does not. But you sort of need to answer those questions so that everyone has the same information. And as soon as I have all the information, then I'm engaged in the story and I'm ready to hear the sort of the challenge part. So the task, why was it challenging, right? Why was it hard? This is the sort of the drama in the story that you're trying to get to that is important to hold the attention of your interviewer, right? So if you just said, it was a project we were working on and we were successfully able to complete it, right? And you sort of skip over the challenge. It's a perfectly good story, but it's not a very engaging story, right? So there was a project and you did it. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes that's what people need you to do. The challenge demonstrates where the drama is, right? So we were working on this project. It was hard because we didn't have this. And so what I had to do, one of the problems that we faced was, right? And it adds that sort of tension to the story. All stories have a little bit of tension built into them that are stories that captivate people. So that's really what you're trying to do. Now, obviously, the challenge that you're setting up is the thing that your behavior that you're going to be focusing on overcomes, right? So if the question is about teamwork or communication or leadership, then the challenge should be related to those elements. And then the action that you take should be that behavior illustrated, how your behavior worked to overcome that situation. So the challenge is sort of, again, it's a short sort of insight into why this thing was difficult or challenging. And then the action is where you spend most of the time talking about your skill and your experiences, because this is the illustration of how your experience was successful in overcoming that challenge. So you want to spend most of the time here in terms of the answer. You want to make sure that it's about you and not about we, right? A lot of the question, the answers that I get in mock interviews, someone will say, so this was a challenge. And so what we did was this. And then what happens when you use the word we is that I don't know what role you played in that, right? Maybe you had a tiny role and everyone else did the work. I don't know necessarily, who the we is in that context. Hopefully you sort of included that in the context, but you're basically diluting your impact by having the we. Now, it may have been a collaborative approach, but in every collaborative approach, you have an individual contribution that you can talk about. So you can say, as part of our group effort, what I did was this. So the answer has to be centered around you because you are the person interviewing for the job that's out there. And then the result is important to wrap up the story. Sometimes people get to the action and they talk about what you did, but you don't then sort of finish it up. And the result is just the conclusion to it, right? And it worked out well because we were able to get over this roadblock. It worked out well because we found the new data. It worked out well because we published it. And so there's lots of different types of results, but it's really the way that the story ends so that it's a complete narrative about your experiences and what that looks like. Now, there's a couple of other aspects here that I think you can add in that sort of help you provide more insight to the interviewer, right? So that it's the what you're thinking about, not just what you're doing. And so what I would add to the STAR format, to turn it into the STARer format or the SCARer format, if we're using my acronym, are sort of the emotional resonance that you get from that experience, what you learned, what you were thinking about. It's you taking a step back and saying, this was really great because, I really found it satisfying. I really enjoyed it. And allowing you to integrate some of that emotional resonance into that story. And I'll give you some examples of what that looks like in just a second. And then the relevance is obviously how relevant that story is or that experience is to the job itself. That's something that you can touch on as well. So in terms of the emotions, this is where you sort of take a step back from the experience. You say, this was great. I learned a lot from this. I really enjoyed this. It was really interesting how. This is going to be important, especially when it comes to these negative leaning questions, because this is you being reflective about a situation. In this case, most of the stories that you're telling will be positive stories. Sometimes they will be more negative, but you can still reflect on that. So that emotional intelligence that we talked about last time comes to life when you're doing this part of the STAR format, the extra bits here. And then the relevance obviously is allowing you to sort of say, look, let me tell you about the story. It worked out really well. I use this skill and I know this is valuable in this role because having spoken to several alumni, they say that this is what they rely on to do X and Y. And you don't want to do that for every question because it will sound too contrived, but I think there's a lot of benefit to sort of tying it into the relevant role. So then let's get back to these positive and negative leaning stories, right? So positive versions on the left, negative versions on the right. Just give me an example of a time where you're part of a successful team. Give me an example of a time where the team didn't work, where you solved a problem, where you weren't able to solve a problem, where you were able to have a great success, where you failed. Sometimes these positive and negative ones come down to the sort of greatest strength and greatest weakness type questions, right? So what is your greatest strength? And people are sometimes a little bit hesitant to jump into that one. So oftentimes when I ask this question in a mock interview, the answer is, well, I think my greatest strength is, right? And it's sort of very hesitant and not very confident. And then I ask the greatest weakness question and people say, well, yes, my greatest weakness is X and Y and Z, but also I can't do this. And people love to sort of jump into the weaknesses and create a whole list of those, even though I only asked for one. It says something about our psyche, I think, but people are much more hesitant to sort of confidently talk about the strengths, but much more comfortable talking about their weaknesses. And then this last one, leadership, when it went well and you were able to do something and when it wasn't successful. So here then is the main structure that you're going to need to answer these negative leaning questions. The first thing that you're going to have to do is actually find an example where something didn't go well. And you are going to have to talk about that, right? Because it is a reality. It's something that everyone has faced. You get to pick and choose the story, but also how much of the story that you share. Remember, it's still your story. It has to be an authentic story, but you don't have to tell the whole story, but it needs to be its own star story, right? So back when I was beginning my internship, I was working on a project with 2 senior fellows, and we were trying to do X. This thing happened, it was difficult. I wasn't able to keep up with the project work, so I fell behind, and then this thing happened, right? So that can be a story. What happens after that, and I'll give you a little bit more nuances to that in just a second. What happens after that is then you reflect on that, right? And you say, I thought about it and I've been thinking about it, or, I talked to my supervisor about this after that issue, and what I learned from that was this, or what I found helpful about our discussion was this. Then there's some actions that you can integrate into that. So not only is it your learning, but there's doing too. I learned this. And so what I did was this. I took a course. I've been practicing this. I've looked for ways to do more of this so I can be better at this. And then the real secret then to these negative leaning questions is to finish the answer with another star story that illustrates how you've taken what you've learned and applied it to a similar situation. And that star story should be a positive one. So in a negative leading question, you're going to give a star story that isn't positive. You're going to give some information about how you've thought about this and what you've done about this. And then ideally, you're going to give a story that shows what you've done, how you've used that skill or that behavior differently in a similar situation. It does not mean that the thing that you didn't do well in the first story is now the best thing that you have now. It doesn't have to go from greatest weakness situation to greatest strength. It just has to be something that you thought about, reflected on, learned something about, and then applied more successfully moving forward. And that's an authentic story because that's how people grow as professionals moving forward. So my strategy for these types of questions, when you're telling that first star story, is to try to find a time in the past, right? You don't want to tell a present story about how things are going wrong now, because you can't really reflect on what you took away from that. And you can't talk about things that you've done to change it. And you can't talk about, give an example of you integrating that. So oftentimes when people talk about these stories, they might say, and what I've realized is that I need more practice in presenting to large audiences. And so hopefully I can gain that, right? And they leave this sort of very hypothetical, in the future, I hope to address this. I want to be better at this in the future. And that's not very reassuring to the interviewer that you can do that, right? Because if you wanted to do that and it was a priority for you, then it should have happened in the past. If you've yet to do it, then there's a risk that you won't do it, that you won't gain those new skills, you won't be better moving forward. So if you can, shifting back a few months, a couple of years, can be helpful to distance you, the version of you right now in present time you, from that experience. So if you're a PhD, when I first started my research, when I first started at Penn, if you had an internship, at the beginning of my 3-month internship, this. But by the end of my internship, this, right? And so there's, even within a 3-month window, there's an opportunity to have thought about, reflected on, enacted a change, and then maybe had an opportunity to use that. The distance is important. It separates you from the issue right now. Make sure that your narrative and what you're selling is a different version of that sort of more negative experience. What you learn from the experience, right? So you can be honest about this. I didn't like it. I did not enjoy that. That was something that I've really sort of thought about that I felt like was not fun or was not good. But this is what I've done about that, right? So this is how I've tried to better myself, my experiences, my skills, so that I don't experience that again. Again, your goal here is not to throw anyone else under the bus. If it's a negative experience, it's possible that everyone had some contribution to that. It doesn't all have to be about your negative experience, right? A part of a team that went badly, for example, it's not because you were bad. It's not even because the one other person, was the bad apple in the cart, as it were. It may have just been that you didn't, as a collective group, have a strategy to bring yourself together, right? So you can say that, I don't think we did that. I know that I could have done better at communicating with my teammates. That's something that I took away from that. So it's not all you, but you are part of that experience as well. And then the longer star story is the more positive one, where you say, and actually given that, I'm glad that I did do this learning. I'm glad I took that training, because in my most recent project experience, I faced a similar situation. We had a team brought all together, new people didn't know each other. So this is what we did. I spent some more time engaging with them and doing brainstorming and helping them understand, the skills and strengths that we all brought to that aspect. And that's the story that you want to end with. It ends on a positive note because you say, and actually it's worked out really well. Our team is being really productive, and we have, 2 of the 3 projects that we're working on completed. And that's what the interviewer will take away from that scenario, is that you have these skills and strengths that are going to be valuable, but you're also able to grow and evolve and adapt, right? That's sort of another key skill set that I think people are looking for. So these are just sort of snippets of what those stories might be, right? So a negative, give me an example of teamwork that didn't go well. You might be able to say, well, I was part of a team, but it didn't go well because it looked like I didn't get buy-in from the team. I wanted to do this, but I rushed ahead and it didn't work out well. The learning could be just reflective learning. Looking back at it, I think my main mistake there was I didn't get that, and I needed to find better ways to get people's opinions in so that they could be bought in. And then the positive might be, in a recent project that I've just started, and it could just be a recent one, I've done a brainstorming session about people's skills, and that's really helped people, energize people, and I feel like there's a lot more buy-in. So even if the present story isn't a complete story, the outcome is still, I feel like there's a lot more buy-in. So you can still end on that positive note. Communication, again, you could say I was presenting, and when I was presenting my research, people didn't understand what I was talking about, basically. So it was exciting to me, but no one else really got it. So what I've done is I've really listened to people. I've listened to the people who might be audiences. I understand where their challenges are. I've had these informational interviews. Those have helped me identify where people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And this is then how I've adapted, right? This is now how I describe my research. You can give an example of how you describe your research. You can point to a thing that you've done. Again, just an example of a story. And then a leadership one. Again, this is just another example here of what this might look like. In this context, in terms of the learning experience, I've identified, I sought out feedback from my supervisor, or probably more realistically, I got feedback from my supervisor who said X. And this is actually a really important thing to sort of think about, because being able to receive and process critical feedback is a skill in itself, right? Every job that you go to, sometime your supervisor is going to say, look, there's a thing that you should be doing better that you haven't done. I'm disappointed. And how you respond to that sort of says a lot about you and how you fit into different environments. But anytime that you can say, again, honestly and authentically, I appreciated that feedback. It was hard, but I really appreciated it. And this is what I did with that feedback. This is how I changed the course I was on using the feedback that I got from my mentor, from my supervisor, from my peers, because being able to receive and act on critical feedback is important. Doesn't mean that all critical feedback is the right feedback. You can't control that, but how you process that information is actually an important part of that situation. So thinking about these types of experiences that you might have had in the past that didn't feel positive, and then really breaking them down into their own star stories and thinking about not just the story that you could tell about the negative one, but what you learned from it, what you did about it, and then an example that couples with that previous experience that is a more positive version of that. To me, that's a very important part of the process. Now, sometimes the skills that are brought up as part of these negative leading questions, they're complicated skills or competencies or clusters of skills, right? So give me an example of a time where your innovation didn't work well. Innovation is not a singular, doesn't have a singular meaning, right? It can be specific to different contexts or different scenarios, or rather it can look different. It's the same approach, but it looks different in different situations. So this is just a reminder that sometimes it's worth defining the skills before you jump into an example, right? So if someone says, give me an example of a time where, the leadership that you used in a scenario didn't work out well, if you jump into a story and your description of leadership doesn't quite match the description of leadership that your interviewers have, then they may not sort of see the value in the story itself. Again, this works for positive stories, sort of works for the negative ones as well. Sometimes it's worth taking a step back and saying, well, to me, leadership means X, right? So if someone says, give me an example of this, give me an example of how you've supported diversity in your field. To me, diversity means this, or supporting diversity means this. To me, ambiguity means this. If you define the term up front, then the story that you tell about it, or the stories that you tell about it, are going to be more meaningful because the interviewers know how you're defining that term. They may not agree 100% with how you define it, but since you are the one being interviewed, they will go with your definition, and your examples will be more contextually relevant because you've defined the concept and then you've illustrated it in action. So just, a reminder that defining the terms puts the answer on more solid ground as you're giving it, because it's now well defined. It's also one of these strategies that you can use to give yourself a little bit more time to think of an example or a story when you don't have one, right? So when someone says, give me an example of a time when you've done this, and you're like, I've never done this. You need some time to think sometimes before you jump in. Some of those strategies just mean saying, that's a really great question. Let me see if I can think of a good example, right? And then you basically tell the interviewer that you're thinking now, so that they need just to wait patiently. But you can also use the defining the concept as a way to give your brain time to catch up. So, give me an example of a time where you weren't able to handle ambiguity in the workplace environment. You're like, that's a complex concept. So then you can say, well, let me try to define what I mean by ambiguity first, right? And then you can sort of piece together a definition that sort of makes sense. And as you're doing that, the stories that you sort of have preloaded in your brain can sort of come to the forefront as you're moving forward. So let's cover a few resources. As we are approaching the end of this session, feel free to throw questions in the chat so I can answer those before we wrap up. But on the Career Services website, we do have a Learn How to Interview section where we've gathered together lots of resources on interviewing, so do take a look at that. We have an interviewing guide for graduate students and postdocs. Again, this is sort of broadly interviewing, more focused perhaps on professional roles as opposed to faculty roles, but there's benefit for, in terms of the content that we're providing this for anyone engaging in an interview process right now. LinkedIn Learning, a great set of skills, sort of workshops and resources out there. So, 294 behavioral interview question type resources on LinkedIn Learning. That's freely accessible to you as a student and postdoc at Penn. It's something that you lose when you graduate, so do take advantage of it right now. It's a great tool. Big Interview, obviously I'm not going to go into much detail for this because I'm going to start covering this in slightly more detail at 11 o'clock in our next session. But they have a video curriculum on how to answer common interview questions, on how to do behavioral-based answers. They have a star story builder tool where you can basically go through and piece together the different components of your star stories and write them down, not as a script, but just so you know what the structure of that story is and how you can take advantage of those stories in interviews. Because the best way to prepare for any interviews is actually to have thought about the stories that you want to tell beforehand, not wait until you actually get to the interview and then try to think of the story. So preload into your brain stories that you want to tell, and then when those questions come up, you're ready to sort of take those stories and adapt those. So a really good tool there. They have mock interviews that you can utilize for different industries, so you can practice your star stories. If you're a PhD, the Aurora platform has interview prep for both professional paths and academic paths, faculty paths, so you can watch some of the resources there and use some of the workbooks that you'll be able to gain from that.